In a world where royal protocols dictate every interaction, where guards maintain respectful distance and princesses live behind carefully constructed walls of formality, sometimes the most profound moments come from the most unexpected places. What happens when a simple gesture from someone society deems ordinary touches the heart of someone the world considers extraordinary? This is the story of how one security guard's quiet observation, genuine care, and heartfelt gift shattered the barriers between duty and humanity, reminding us all that kindness knows no boundaries of class, position, or protocol. It's a story that proves the most precious gifts aren't wrapped in expensive paper or adorned with royal seals, but come from the depths of human compassion and understanding. Sometimes it takes just one person to see past the crown to find the woman beneath, and sometimes that recognition can change everything. Thomas McKenna had been working security at the royal estate for 7 years, and in all that time he had perfected the art of being invisible. At 52, with graying temples and kind eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses, he understood his role perfectly. He was there to protect, to observe, and to blend into the background of royal life like a piece of well-placed furniture. The morning shift always began the same way. Thomas would arrive at the estate gates before dawn, exchange quiet nods with the night guards, and take his position at the East Wing entrance. It was a post that afforded him a clear view of the private gardens where Princess Catherine often took her morning walks. Over the years, he had developed an almost scientific understanding of the royal family's routines, but it was Catherine's patterns that he noticed most keenly. Every morning at precisely 7:30, she would emerge from the French doors, wearing her burgundy coat and comfortable walking shoes. She would pause on the stone terrace, breathing in the morning air, before beginning her solitary circuit around the rose garden. Thomas had timed these walks countless times, 23 minutes every single day unless the weather was particularly harsh. But lately, something had changed. It started 3 months ago, just after the princess had returned from a particularly challenging royal tour. Thomas had been on duty that evening when her car pulled through the gates. Even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion etched into her features as she stepped out of the vehicle. Her usually perfect posture seemed to sag under an invisible weight, and her smile, the one that graced magazine covers worldwide, was nowhere to be seen. The morning walks continued, but they were different now. Catherine would still emerge at 7:30, but her pace had slowed. Where once she walked with purpose and energy, now her steps seemed heavy, contemplative. Thomas noticed she had begun pausing frequently, sometimes standing motionless for several minutes while staring at the fountain in the center of the garden. What concerned Thomas most were the tears. At first, he thought he had imagined it. A trick of the early morning light, perhaps, or dew from the garden catching the sun. But as days passed, he became certain. Princess Catherine was crying during her morning walks. Not the dramatic sobs of grief or anger, but the quiet, steady tears of someone carrying a burden too heavy for their shoulders. Thomas had served in the military before joining the Royal Security Detail, and he recognized the signs. He had seen them in fellow soldiers, in his own mirror after particularly difficult deployments, and now he was seeing them in one of the most photographed women in the world. The carefully maintained facade was cracking, and behind it was a human being in pain. The revelation troubled him more than he expected. In his years of service, Thomas had always maintained professional distance. The royal family were his charges, not his friends. He protected their bodies, not their emotions. But watching Catherine's silent suffering day after day awakened something in him that he had thought was buried beneath years of military discipline and security protocols. Thomas began to pay closer attention to the details others missed. He noticed that Catherine's appetite had diminished. The breakfast trays that were carried to her private quarters returned barely touched. Her assistant, Maria, would often emerge from meetings with the princess looking concerned and frustrated. The household staff, usually cheerful and bustling, moved through the corridors with worried whispers. The princess was struggling, and despite being surrounded by dozens of staff members, advisors, and family members, she seemed utterly alone. Thomas had grown up in a small Irish village where everyone looked after everyone else. His mother, God rest her soul, had raised him with a simple philosophy. When you see someone hurting, you help if you can. It didn't matter if they were the baker's daughter or the queen herself. Pain was pain, and kindness was kindness. But how could a security guard help a princess? The answer came to him during one particularly difficult morning. Catherine had emerged for her walk looking more fragile than usual. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she descended the terrace steps. Halfway through her walk, she had stopped at the fountain and broken down completely. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she gripped the stone edge for support. Thomas had trained himself to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. But in that moment, his professional detachment crumbled. He wanted to approach her, to offer comfort somehow, but protocol bound him to his post. He could only watch as she composed herself, wiped her tears, and continued her walk as if nothing had happened. That evening, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He sat in his modest apartment above the estate's carriage house, nursing a cup of tea and staring out at the gardens where Catherine walked each morning. His walls were decorated with photographs from his military service and a few personal mementos, but his eyes kept drifting to a small framed picture on his bedside table. It was a photograph of his daughter Emma, taken just weeks before she lost her battle with cancer at the age of 28. Emma had been a nurse, dedicated to helping others even as her own body failed her. In her final days, she had shared something with her father that he had never forgotten. "Dad," she had whispered from her hospital bed, "the hardest part isn't the pain or the fear. It's feeling like you're invisible, like your struggle doesn't matter to anyone. The smallest acknowledgement, the tiniest gesture of understanding, it means everything." Looking at Emma's photograph now, Thomas felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Princess Catherine wasn't just a royal figure to be protected from physical harm. She was a human being who was hurting, who felt invisible despite being constantly observed, and who needed someone to acknowledge her struggle. The next morning, Thomas watched Catherine begin her walk with renewed purpose. She was wearing the same burgundy coat, taking the same path around the rose garden. But today he was seeing her differently. Today, he was seeing Emma in her quiet suffering, seeing his mother's wisdom in her solitude, seeing an opportunity to honor both their memories. As Catherine paused at the fountain, Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives. He began to observe not just for security purposes, but with genuine care. He noticed which flowers she lingered near longest, which benches she favored when she needed to rest, which paths she avoided on her most difficult days. He paid attention to the small details that revealed her state of mind, the way she held her shoulders when she was trying to be strong, the particular way she touched the fountain's edge when the tears came, the slight smile that occasionally graced her features when she spotted a bird or butterfly in the garden. Thomas started to understand Catherine's language of grief, and with that understanding came an idea. It was unconventional, possibly inappropriate by royal standards, but it came from the same place that had guided his mother's kindness and Emma's compassion. He was going to give Princess Catherine a gift, not something expensive or elaborate, but something that would show her that someone saw her pain, understood her struggle, and cared about her healing. The idea took shape slowly, carefully, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Thomas knew he would have only one chance to get it right. The gift would need to be perfect, not because of its monetary value, but because of its meaning. It would need to speak to Catherine's heart in a way that all the formal condolences and official statements could not. As he watched her complete another solitary walk, Thomas began to plan. He would need time to prepare, careful observation to get the details right, and considerable courage to break with protocol. But Emma's words echoed in his mind, and his mother's lessons guided his heart. Princess Catherine was invisible in her pain, despite being the most visible woman in the kingdom. Thomas McKenna, the quiet guard who had perfected the art of being unseen, was about to make sure she knew that someone truly saw her. The foundation for something extraordinary had been laid in the simple act of one human being recognizing another's suffering. What would grow from that recognition would touch not just two lives, but everyone who witnessed the power of unexpected compassion. In a world of rigid protocols and careful distances, Thomas was about to discover that the most meaningful gifts are born not from obligation or expectation, but from the simple, revolutionary act of seeing someone's pain and choosing to care. Catherine Elizabeth Windsor had dreamed of many things as a child, but being a princess was never one of them. Born into nobility, but not direct line royalty, she had enjoyed a childhood filled with riding lessons, charity work, and the kind of structured freedom that came with aristocratic privilege. Marriage to Prince William had changed everything, transforming her from Catherine Middleton into Princess Catherine, from a private citizen into a public institution. The transformation had been gradual at first. Photo opportunities became daily occurrences. Her clothing choices made headlines. Every expression was analyzed, every gesture dissected by experts and amateur observers alike. She had adapted, learned to smile on command, to wave with precisely the right enthusiasm, to speak in measured tones that revealed nothing while seeming to share everything. But the real weight of the crown had become unbearable only recently, triggered by a series of events that had shaken her to her core. It began with the letter from Sarah. Sarah Matthews had been Catherine's roommate at university, Her closest friend during those precious years when she was still just Kate, when she could wear old jeans and oversized sweaters, when she could laugh too loudly and stay up too late without anyone caring. They had maintained their friendship even after the wedding, though royal obligations had made it increasingly difficult to find time for the long conversations that had once sustained them both. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the regular correspondence that Maria sorted and prioritized each day. Unlike the official documents and formal invitations that made up most of Catherine's mail, this envelope was handwritten, personal, urgent in its simplicity. Sarah was dying. The cancer had returned, more aggressive than before, and the doctors were offering months rather than years. She was writing to her old friend not to ask for anything, but simply to say goodbye. The letter was filled with memories of their university days, gratitude for their friendship, and a gentle understanding of why Catherine might not be able to visit. "I know how complicated your life has become," Sarah had written in her still familiar handwriting. "I know you can't just drop everything and come sit with me like we used to do. But I wanted you to know that some of my happiest memories are of those times when we were just two girls figuring out our lives. Thank you for seeing me as Sarah, not as someone who needed something from you." Catherine had read the letter 3 times before the full weight of it sank in. Her dearest friend was dying, and that friend believed Catherine wouldn't come because of royal obligations. The assumption was both wrong and heartbreakingly accurate. Catherine wanted nothing more than to drive to Sarah's cottage in the countryside, to hold her hand and reminisce about better days. But the machinery of royal life made such simple gestures impossibly complex. Any visit would require security assessments, media management, official protocols. Sarah's quiet cottage would be transformed into a circus of photographers and reporters. Her final weeks would become a public spectacle, her private grief turned into content for the insatiable appetite of public curiosity. Catherine had tried anyway. She had approached her private secretary, then a press secretary, then finally Prince William himself. Each conversation had ended the same way. Too risky, they said. Too complicated. The media attention would be overwhelming for someone in Sarah's condition. Perhaps a private phone call would be more appropriate. A phone call. For someone who had been her sister in everything but blood, who had held her hair back when she was sick, who had listened to her fears about marrying into the royal family, who had been present for every major moment of Catherine's adult life until the crown had built walls between them. A phone call. She had spoken to Sarah for 20 precious minutes, both of them crying, both of them pretending it was enough. But when she hung up, Catherine felt something break inside her that she hadn't known was intact. She realized that the price of her position wasn't just privacy or spontaneity. It was the ability to be present for the people who mattered most when they needed her. Sarah died on a Thursday morning in April. Catherine learned about it from Maria, who had seen the obituary in the local newspaper and thought the princess should know. There had been a small funeral, just family and close friends, the kind of intimate gathering that Sarah would have wanted. Catherine had sent flowers and a private note, but she hadn't been there. She hadn't held Sarah's mother as she wept, hadn't shared memories with the friends who gathered to celebrate a life well lived, hadn't said goodbye to the person who had known her longest and loved her most. The guilt was crushing. 2 weeks later, Catherine received another letter. This one was from James, Sarah's younger brother, thanking her for the flowers and sharing something that made Catherine's grief even more complex. In her final days, Sarah had spoken often about her royal friend, expressing pride in Catherine's work and understanding of the sacrifices her position required. She had asked James to tell Catherine something important. She didn't blame her for not coming. She understood. She was proud of the woman Catherine had become, even if it meant they couldn't share her final moments. The forgiveness was almost harder to bear than blame would have been. Catherine began to see her life with brutal clarity. She lived in a beautiful prison, surrounded by luxury and privilege, but unable to perform the most basic acts of human connection when they mattered most. She could visit hospitals and schools, could shake hands with hundreds of strangers, could smile for thousands of photographs, but she couldn't sit beside her dying friend. The morning walks became her only escape, the only time when she could let the mask slip and acknowledge the grief that was consuming her. In the garden, surrounded by roses and protected by distance from prying eyes, she could finally cry, for Sarah, for herself, for the friendship that had been sacrificed to the demands of duty. But even grief had to be managed carefully in royal life. Her staff noticed the changes, of course. Maria would glance at her with concern when she thought Catherine wasn't looking. The household staff moved more quietly. spoke in softer tones, handled her with the gentle care reserved for something precious and fragile. Even Prince William, caught up in his own royal obligations, began to watch her with worried eyes. The concern was well-meaning but suffocating. Catherine felt like a specimen under glass, observed and analyzed, but never truly seen. Everyone around her was monitoring her emotional state, but no one seemed to understand that what she needed wasn't management or protection. She needed someone to acknowledge that her grief was valid, that losing Sarah mattered, that being unable to be present for her friend's death was a wound that wouldn't heal with time or royal duties. She began to feel like she was disappearing, becoming less of a person and more of a performance with each passing day. The morning walks became desperate attempts to reconnect with herself, to remember who she had been before the crown had claimed her, to honor Sarah's memory in the only way she could. It was during one of these walks, 3 weeks after Sarah's funeral, that Catherine noticed the flowers. Someone had planted daffodils near the fountain, a small cluster of bright yellow blooms that hadn't been there the day before. Catherine stared at them in confusion. The garden was meticulously maintained by a team of professionals who followed strict guidelines about plantings. Nothing appeared without careful planning and approval. The daffodils were Sarah's favorite flower. She had filled her cottage garden with them every spring, claiming they were proof that even the darkest winters eventually ended. Catherine had forgotten this detail, buried it beneath layers of grief and guilt, but seeing the cheerful blooms brought the memory flooding back. She knelt beside the flowers, touching the soft petals with trembling fingers. They were freshly planted, the soil around them still dark with moisture. Someone had put them there recently, carefully, with obvious care for their placement and presentation. But who? And why? Catherine looked around the garden with new awareness. The estate employed dozens of gardeners, any one of whom could have planted the daffodils. But the placement felt deliberate, meaningful, as if someone had chosen this specific spot for a specific reason. The fountain where she paused each morning, where she allowed herself to grieve, where she felt closest to Sarah's memory. The flowers were a message, but Catherine couldn't decipher from whom or what it meant. Over the following days, she found herself looking forward to her morning walks with anticipation rather than just need. The daffodils had introduced an element of mystery into her carefully controlled world, a suggestion that someone was paying attention to her pain in a way that went beyond professional duty. More changes appeared gradually, subtly. A bench that had been uncomfortable was suddenly cushioned with a weather-resistant pad that perfectly matched the garden's color scheme.
The path where she walked was cleared of the small stones that had occasionally caught in her walking shoes.
A bird bath appeared near her favorite resting spot, quickly attracting a family of robins whose cheerful songs provided comfort during her most difficult moments. Each addition was small, thoughtful, placed with obvious care and attention to her needs. But whoever was responsible remained invisible, working their quiet magic during the hours when Catherine wasn't in the garden. She began to feel less alone. The changes weren't dramatic enough to attract official attention, but they were meaningful enough to touch Catherine's heart in ways that all the formal condolences and official support hadn't managed. Someone was seeing her pain and responding with kindness. Someone cared enough to make her morning sanctuary a place of healing rather than just grief. Catherine started to carry herself differently. The heavy weight of despair that had settled on her shoulders after Sarah's death began to lift slightly. She found herself looking forward to discovering what small surprise might await her in the garden, what gentle gesture might remind her that she was still a person worthy of care and consideration. The identity of her anonymous benefactor became a puzzle that occupied her thoughts during the long hours of official duties. She studied the faces of the gardening staff, the household employees, even her personal security detail, looking for some sign of recognition or acknowledgement. But everyone maintained their professional demeanor, giving no indication that they were responsible for the small miracles appearing in her garden. Catherine began to feel like she was part of a secret conversation, a dialogue conducted through flowers and thoughtful improvements rather than words. Someone was speaking to her grief with actions, offering comfort without expectation or recognition. For the first time since Sarah's death, Catherine felt truly seen, not as a princess to be managed or protected, but as a woman in pain who deserved compassion and care. The anonymous gestures were more healing than any therapy session, more comforting than any official support. Someone understood her suffering, and that understanding was being expressed through the quiet language of kindness. As spring progressed, Catherine found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. The guilt over Sarah's death remained, but it was tempered by gratitude for the mysterious friend who was helping her process her grief. The morning walks became less about crying and more about appreciating the small gifts that appeared with increasing frequency. She still didn't know who was responsible for her garden sanctuary, but she was beginning to understand that the identity mattered less than the intention. Someone cared about her well-being without wanting anything in return. In a world where every interaction was carefully choreographed and every gesture had political implications, this pure act of compassion was more precious than any crown jewel. Catherine began to believe that perhaps she was more than just a princess, more than just a performer in the royal drama. Perhaps she was still, fundamentally, the person Sarah had loved, the friend who deserved kindness, the woman who could be healed by simple acts of human connection. The foundation for something extraordinary was being built in secret. One small gesture at a time, by someone who understood that healing happens not through grand proclamations, but through quiet acts of love. Thomas McKenna had always been good with his hands. As a young boy in County Cork, he had helped his father repair fishing nets and build stone walls that could withstand Atlantic storms. During his military service, he had been the soldier his unit turned to when equipment broke or when something needed fixing, with minimal resources and maximum ingenuity. After Emma died, working with his hands had become his therapy, his way of channeling grief into something constructive and meaningful. Now, those skills were being put to their most important use yet. The project had started simply enough. Thomas had spent weeks observing Catherine's morning routine, noting not just her emotional state, but the practical details of her environment. He saw how she winced when stepping on the loose stones near the east path, how she rubbed her lower back after sitting on the uncomfortable stone bench, how she seemed drawn to areas of the garden where birds gathered and flowers bloomed most abundantly. His first intervention had been the daffodils. Thomas had researched extensively before making that choice, using the estate's library to study the language of flowers, consulting with the head gardener about soil conditions and bloom times, even reaching out to a former military colleague who had become a horticulturist after his service. He wanted to be certain that his message would be clear but not overwhelming, meaningful but not intrusive. The planting had required careful timing and considerable stealth. Thomas had waited for a Tuesday evening when Catherine had retired early and the garden staff had finished their daily maintenance. He had prepared the soil during his lunch break, mixing in compost and plant food to ensure the daffodils would thrive. The actual planting took only 20 minutes, but he had spent hours choosing the perfect location, the ideal angle, the right spacing to create a natural-looking cluster that would catch Catherine's eye without appearing obviously placed. He had watched from his post the next morning as she discovered the flowers, had seen the moment of confusion followed by recognition, the way her hand had trembled as she touched the petals. The tears that followed were different from the ones he had observed before. These weren't tears of despair, but of surprise, possibly even hope. The success of the daffodils encouraged Thomas to continue, but he knew he had to be careful. Too much too quickly would raise suspicions, might even frighten Catherine, or alert the other staff members to his activities. He needed to pace his interventions, to make each addition seem natural and unplanned. The cushioned bench had been his next project, and it had required considerably more planning. Thomas had noticed that Catherine often sat on a particular stone bench during her walks, usually when she was having an especially difficult morning. The bench was positioned perfectly to provide privacy while offering a beautiful view of the rose garden, but it was clearly uncomfortable for extended sitting. Catherine would shift frequently, sometimes standing and stretching her back, obviously in discomfort but reluctant to cut her sanctuary time short. Creating a weather-resistant cushion that would look appropriately elegant for a royal garden while providing genuine comfort had been a challenge that consumed Thomas's evenings for nearly 2 weeks. He had driven to fabric shops in neighboring towns, consulted with upholsterers, even watched online tutorials about outdoor furniture restoration. The final product was a masterpiece of subtle engineering, a cushion filled with marine-grade foam, covered in fabric that matched the garden's color palette perfectly, and treated with invisible protective coatings that would resist rain, sun, and the daily wear of use. Installing it had required military-level precision. Thomas had waited for a rainy Thursday when Catherine rarely took her full walk, giving him a larger window of opportunity. He had prepared everything in advance, including backup plans in case he was discovered. The actual installation took mere minutes, but he had rehearsed it dozens of times to ensure smooth execution. The cushion had to appear as if it had always belonged there, as if some thoughtful estate manager had finally addressed a long-overlooked comfort issue. Thomas had even roughed up the edges slightly and applied a light coating of garden soil to age it, ensuring it wouldn't look suspiciously new. Catherine's reaction the next morning had been worth every hour of preparation. Thomas had watched as she approached her usual bench, paused in surprise at seeing the cushion, then settled onto it with visible relief. She had sat longer than usual that morning, and for the first time in weeks, Her posture had seemed relaxed rather than tense. Each subsequent project had grown more complex and more personally meaningful. The bird bath had been inspired by a conversation Thomas had overheard between Catherine and Maria about the princess's childhood love of birdwatching. As a girl, she had kept detailed journals about the different species she observed, complete with sketches and notes about their behaviors. Thomas had spent days researching which type of bird bath would attract the varieties most common to the estate's grounds, consulting with ornithology societies, and even contacting a wildlife photographer who specialized in British birds. The final choice had been a shallow, natural stone basin, positioned at precisely the right height and angle to attract robins, wrens, and the occasional thrush. Thomas had tested various locations throughout the garden during his off hours, looking for the spot that would provide Catherine with the best viewing opportunities, while ensuring the birds felt safe and comfortable. The installation had required the most complex logistics yet. The bird bath was heavy, requiring Thomas to transport it in sections and assemble it on site during the brief window between the night patrol's final round and the morning groundskeeping shift. He had prepared the base during his lunch breaks over several days, creating a stable foundation that looked naturally weathered. When the first robin appeared at the new bird bath 3 days later, Thomas had felt a pride that rivaled any military commendation. Watching Catherine's face light up as she observed the small birds splashing in the morning sun was worth every risk he had taken. But Thomas's most ambitious project was still ahead of him, inspired by something he had discovered during his careful research into Catherine's past. In the estate's archives, Thomas had found old photographs from Catherine's university years, images from charity events and school functions that showed her in more casual settings. In several of these photos, she was wearing or holding small handmade items: a knitted scarf in university colors, a friendship bracelet, a small clay pot painted with wildflowers. These weren't expensive accessories, but personal touches that spoke of relationships, of people who had taken time to create something specifically for her. Thomas realized that what Catherine was missing wasn't just comfort or beauty in her environment. She was missing the touch of personal craftsmanship, the knowledge that someone had spent their own time and skill creating something uniquely for her. All the luxury and grandeur surrounding her daily life was magnificent but impersonal, chosen by committees and purchased by staff members. The idea that began forming in Thomas's mind was both simple and profound. He would create something entirely unique for Catherine, something that could exist nowhere else in the world, something that would speak directly to her heart while honoring the memory of the friend she had lost. The project would require months of careful work, research, and preparation. It would push Thomas's skills to their limits and require him to learn new techniques, to study subjects he had never considered, to become an expert in areas far removed from his security training. But Emma's voice whispered encouragement in his ear, and his mother's lessons about kindness guided his hands. Thomas began spending his evenings in the estate's workshops, areas normally used for maintenance and repairs but equipped with tools that could serve his purposes. He studied woodworking techniques, researched different types of wood and their properties, learned about joinery and finishing methods. He consulted books on botanical illustration, practiced sketching flowers and birds, experimented with different artistic techniques. The project consumed him, but it was a joyful consumption. The kind of focused dedication he hadn't felt since Emma's illness had dominated his thoughts and energy. This was creation rather than destruction, hope rather than grief, love expressed through craft rather than duty fulfilled through protocol. Thomas was creating something that would change everything, though he couldn't have predicted just how profound the impact would be. As spring gave way to early summer, Catherine's healing progressed alongside Thomas's secret work. The garden had become her sanctuary, not just for grief, but for renewal. She arrived each morning with anticipation rather than dread, eager to see what small gift might await her, what sign of care and attention might remind her that she was valued as a person rather than just a princess. The anonymous kindness was working its magic slowly but surely. Catherine's staff noticed the change in her demeanor, the lightness returning to her step, the genuine warmth creeping back into her public appearances. She was becoming herself again, though she still had no idea who was responsible for her transformation. Thomas watched her progress with satisfaction and growing anticipation. Soon, very soon, he would complete his masterpiece. The gift that would finally reveal his identity, that would speak all the words he could never say directly, that would honor both Emma's memory and Catherine's pain while celebrating the healing power of human connection. The project was nearly finished, and with it, the most important conversation of Thomas McKenna's life was about to begin. He had learned to speak fluently in the language of kindness, and he was about to deliver the most eloquent message of his career. In a world of protocols and propriety, Thomas was preparing to break every rule that separated a security guard from a princess, but he was about to discover that some boundaries exist only in the mind, and that the most meaningful connections happen when two people recognize their shared humanity, despite the differences that society insists should divide them. The foundation had been laid through months of small gestures and growing trust. Now it was time to build something that would last forever, something that would transform both their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Thomas McKenna, the invisible guard, was about to become unforgettable. And Princess Catherine, the woman who felt unseen despite constant observation, was about to discover that she had been truly seen all along by someone who understood that the most precious gifts come not from wealth or position, but from the decision to care deeply about another person's well-being. The stage was set for a moment that would redefine everything they thought they knew about connection, kindness, and the courage required to reach across the distances that society places between us. The morning of June 15th dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect English weather that made the estate gardens glow like something from a fairy tale. Thomas had been awake since 4, not from insomnia but from the electric anticipation that comes before life-changing moments. Today was the day he would finally reveal himself to Princess Catherine, would present the gift that had consumed months of his life and all of his emotional energy. He had chosen this day carefully. It marked exactly 1 year since Sarah's last visit to the estate, a bittersweet anniversary that Catherine would likely remember and honor in her private way. Thomas had learned through careful observation that certain dates held special significance for the princess, and he wanted his gift to acknowledge the full scope of her grief journey, from loss through healing toward hope. The memory box sat on his small kitchen table, wrapped in soft cloth to protect its finish during transport. Thomas had applied the final coat of oil the previous evening, and the oak now glowed with a warmth that seemed to come from within. Every detail was perfect, every joint tight, every surface smooth. The daffodils carved into the lid seemed almost alive in the morning light, their petals catching shadows that made them appear to dance in a gentle breeze. Thomas dressed with unusual care, choosing his best uniform and taking extra time with his grooming. This wasn't vanity but respect, recognition that he was about to have the most important conversation of his professional life. He wanted to look worthy of the moment, worthy of the trust he was about to request from Catherine. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the wrapped box, and he paused to steady himself with a deep breath. Emma's photograph smiled at him from the bedside table, and he felt her presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. She would have been proud of what he had accomplished, proud of the man he had become in channeling his grief into something beautiful and meaningful. The walk to the garden seemed longer than usual, each step carrying Thomas closer to a moment that would define the rest of his life. He had rehearsed what he would say dozens of times, but now the words seemed inadequate, too small to carry the weight of months of anonymous kindness and countless hours of careful craftsmanship. Thomas positioned himself near the fountain where Catherine paused each morning, the memory box hidden behind a section of hedge where it would remain safe but accessible. He had timed everything perfectly. Catherine typically emerged for her walk at precisely 7:30, and today was no different. Thomas watched from his usual post as the French doors opened and the familiar figure in the burgundy coat stepped onto the terrace. But something was different about Catherine this morning. Her step was lighter, her posture more erect. The crushing weight of grief that had bent her shoulders for so many months had eased, replaced by something that looked almost like anticipation. Thomas realized with a start that his anonymous gifts had accomplished exactly what he had hoped. Catherine was healing, was returning to herself, was ready to move forward from the darkest period of her life. The transformation made what Thomas was about to do even more meaningful. He wasn't just giving a gift to a grieving woman. He was celebrating the resilience of someone who had found her way back to hope. Catherine began her usual circuit around the rose garden, but her pace was slower than normal, more contemplative. Thomas noticed that she paused frequently to examine the flowers, to listen to the birds, to appreciate the morning beauty that surrounded her. She was present in the moment rather than lost in grief, engaged with life rather than enduring it. When she reached the fountain, Catherine sat on the cushioned bench that Thomas had provided months earlier. She closed her eyes and lifted her face to the sun, breathing deeply of the garden's perfume. In that moment, she looked more like the young woman from the university photographs than the burdened princess who had walked these paths in tears. Thomas knew it was time. He retrieved the memory box from its hiding place and approached the garden with steps that felt both heavy and light, burdened with significance yet lifted by purpose. Catherine heard his footsteps on the gravel path and opened her eyes, her expression curious rather than alarmed. In all his years of service, Thomas had never approached her directly. had never spoken to her beyond the most formal greetings.
"Your Highness," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I have something for you." Catherine stood, her curiosity clearly piqued.
Up close, Thomas could see that the darkness had indeed lifted from her eyes, replaced by a clarity and warmth that reminded him why she was so beloved by the public. She was beautiful not just in the classical sense that photographers captured, but with the deeper beauty that comes from wisdom earned through suffering. "Of course," Catherine replied, her voice carrying the natural grace that made her such an effective royal representative. But Thomas detected something else in her tone, a note of recognition that suggested she might have suspected his identity before this moment. Thomas offered her the wrapped box, his hand surprisingly steady now that the moment had finally arrived. "This is for you, ma'am. I hope it brings you some measure of peace." Catherine accepted the gift with obvious curiosity, her fingers exploring its shape through the soft cloth wrapping. The weight and size clearly surprised her. This wasn't flowers or a small garden improvement, but something substantial and permanent. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the bench. "Of course, Your Highness." Catherine sat and began to unwrap the memory box with careful attention, treating the cloth covering with the same respect she would give expensive gift paper. When the oak was finally revealed, her intake of breath was audible and immediate. "Oh," she whispered, her fingers tracing the carved daffodils with obvious emotion. "Oh my." Thomas watched her examine the box with growing amazement, her fingers exploring every detail of the carving, every subtle element of the composition. She discovered the tiny robin among the vines, smiled at the butterfly resting on a daffodil petal, touched the small acorn with something approaching wonder. "This is extraordinary," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "The craftsmanship, the detail, the beauty of it. Did you create this?" "I did, ma'am," Thomas replied, pride and nervousness warring in his voice. "It took some time to get it right." Catherine continued her examination, clearly understanding that she was holding something far more valuable than its materials alone could account for. This wasn't just a beautiful object, but a work of art created specifically for her, crafted with obvious love and infinite care. "The daffodils," she said softly, recognition dawning in her eyes.
"Sarah's favorite flowers, the ones that appeared in the garden." "Yes, ma'am."
"It was you. The words weren't a question, but a statement of understanding."
The cushion, the bird bath, all the small improvements that made my morning walks bearable again. You did all of that. Thomas nodded, suddenly unable to speak as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Catherine lifted the lid of the box, revealing the midnight blue velvet lining that Thomas had fitted with such care. She explored the removable tray with its carefully crafted compartments, understanding immediately how thoughtfully designed every element was. "This is incredible," she breathed. "I've never received anything so personal, so clearly made just for me." Then she discovered the hidden message. Catherine lifted the tray to access the lower compartment and found herself reading the words that Thomas had carved with such trembling hands. "Your Highness, for months I have watched you carry a burden too heavy for anyone to bear alone. Your friend Sarah would be proud of your strength and grace. This box is made from an oak that protected this estate for 2 centuries. May it now protect your most precious memories, as you have been protected by the love of those who see your true worth. You are never as alone as you feel." Thomas McKenna, with deepest respect and admiration. The tears came immediately, but they were different from the tears Thomas had observed during Catherine's darkest days. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion at being truly seen and understood by another human being. "Thomas," she said, her voice breaking on his name, "how did you know? How did you understand what I needed when I didn't even understand it myself?" Thomas sat beside her on the bench, propriety forgotten in the face of genuine human connection. "I lost my daughter Emma to cancer 2 years ago," he said quietly. "She taught me that the hardest part of suffering isn't the pain itself, but feeling invisible in that pain. I saw that you were hurting, and I remembered what Emma said about the importance of being acknowledged, of having someone care enough to notice and respond." Catherine wiped her tears, but they continued to flow as she processed the magnitude of what Thomas had done for her. "All these months, I thought I was going crazy. The little improvements, the thoughtful additions, the way the garden became a place of healing instead of just grief. You did all of that because you understood what I was going through. I did it because you deserved kindness, ma'am." "Because grief should never be faced entirely alone," even when protocol and position make direct comfort impossible. Catherine looked at the memory box again, understanding now that it represented far more than skilled craftsmanship. It was a physical manifestation of months of care, a tangible expression of empathy from someone who had walked his own path through devastating loss. "The oak tree," she said, remembering the storm that had brought it down. "You salvaged it from the northern woods." "Yes, ma'am." It seemed right that something which had sheltered and protected this place for so long should continue to serve in a different way. Catherine traced the carved daffodils again, her touch reverent. Sarah would have loved this. She always said that the most meaningful gifts come from the heart, not the wallet. Your friend sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. And she would have liked you, Thomas. She always valued people who paid attention to others, who cared enough to act on their compassion. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the morning sun warming their faces while birds sang in the trees around them. The barrier between princess and security guard had dissolved completely, replaced by the natural connection between two people who had found understanding and shared experience of loss and healing. "I need to ask you something," Catherine said finally. "Why reveal yourself now? You could have continued being my anonymous guardian angel indefinitely." Thomas considered the question carefully. "Because healing isn't meant to be a solitary journey, ma'am. The anonymous help served its purpose, got you through the worst of the grief. But moving forward requires connection, requires knowing that the people who care about you are real, that the support you've received comes from genuine relationship rather than duty or obligation." Catherine nodded, understanding immediately. "You're saying that I needed to know that someone chose to care about me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to." Exactly. Catherine stood and walked to the fountain, carrying the memory box with obvious care. She looked out over the garden that had been transformed through Thomas's quiet efforts, seeing it now not just as a place of beauty, but as a testament to the power of compassionate action. "What happens now?" she asked, turning back to face Thomas. "How do we proceed from here? I can't pretend that nothing has changed between us, but I also understand the complexity of our positions." Thomas had wrestled with this question for weeks, knowing that revealing himself would fundamentally alter their relationship in ways that couldn't be undone. "I think, ma'am, that we proceed with honesty and respect. I'm still your security officer, and you're still the princess I'm sworn to protect. But now we're also two people who understand something important about each other, who have shared an experience that has meaning beyond our professional roles." Catherine smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile Thomas had seen from her in months. "I think I'd like that very much. But I have one request." "Of course, ma'am." "During your off hours, when we're in the garden, I'd like you to call me Catherine, not your highness or ma'am, just Catherine. After everything you've done for me, I think we can dispense with some of the formality." Thomas felt his eyes fill with tears at this simple but profound gesture of acceptance and friendship. "I would be honored, Catherine." The sun was fully up now, and the garden was alive with the sounds and sights of early summer. Catherine held the memory box close to her chest, already planning what treasures she would place within its velvet-lined compartments. She had found more than healing in Thomas's gift. She had found proof that genuine human connection could transcend any barrier that society might erect between people. "Thank you, Thomas," she said simply, "for seeing me when I felt invisible, for caring when you didn't have to, for creating something so beautiful that it will remind me every day that I am not alone in this world." As Thomas watched Catherine return to the house, carrying his gift with obvious joy and reverence, he felt a peace that had eluded him since Emma's death. He had taken his own grief and transformed it into healing for someone else. He had honored his daughter's memory by preventing another person from feeling invisible in their pain. The memory box would outlive them both, would carry Catherine's most precious treasures through decades of royal service and personal joy. But more than that, it would serve as a reminder that the most profound gifts come not from wealth or position, but from the simple decision to care deeply about another person's well-being. In a world of protocols and proper distances, Thomas McKenna and Princess Catherine had found something far more valuable than professional courtesy. They had found the kind of friendship that changes lives, the kind of connection that proves love and kindness can flourish anywhere they're allowed to take root. The gift that had brought Catherine to tears wasn't just a beautiful box crafted from fallen oak. It was the knowledge that someone had seen her pain, had understood her need, and had spent months of his life creating something that would help her heal. It was proof that she mattered not just as a princess, but as a human being deserving of compassion and care. And for Thomas,
Seeing Catherine's joy and gratitude was worth every risk he had taken, every protocol he had bent, every hour he had spent in careful craftsmanship. He had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts we give are to ourselves, found in the act of giving to others. The morning sun continued to climb, warming the garden where two unlikely friends had found each other through the simple but revolutionary act of recognizing each other's humanity. The memory box would hold Catherine's treasures, but the garden itself would forever hold the memory of the moment when kindness triumphed over protocol, when understanding bridged the gap between different worlds, and when two people discovered that the most meaningful connections often come from the most unexpected places.